Before we start with the presentations and the debates, I would like to make a few announcements. Firstly, let me update you about the upcoming animal welfare related online events, which will be hosted by members of the Intergroup. This afternoon, for instance, from 3 to 5, the Humane Society International, the European Office, and WWF are organizing a very interesting event on achieving coexistence with large carnivores, hosted by MEPs Michael Wiesik and Nikolai Stefanuta. Various possible solutions and strategies will be explored that member states have at their disposal to achieve long-term coexistence with wildlife, with large carnivores especially, for the benefit of people and wildlife conservation. The event will also look at the obstacles and challenges that EU citizens, whether they are farmers, breeders, locals or hunters, face, which may prevent them from successfully coexist with bears, wolves and other large carnivores. Then tomorrow, on Wednesday, 30th September at 6 p.m., the Intergroup Vice President Maria Neuchel will host an event online called A One-Way Ticket to Somewhere or Nowhere, including thirst, heat and agony. The event will be centered on the needs to revise the current EU legislation on animal transport. And among the panelists will be Thomas Schröder, President of the Deutsche Tierschutzbund, Susanne Mittag, SPD member of the Bundestag, and Ina Müller-Arnke of Four Paws. And the debate will be held in German. Another event called Celebrate Pet Power, a virtual gathering that will be held this week on Thursday, the 1st of October at 2 p.m. by Animal Health Europe and VDF. And they will gather animal lovers from all over Europe who will tell their stories of the positive role that pets are playing in society, how they helped us through the lockdown, the importance of responsible care of our pets, and very many more. This virtual meeting will have the participation of Animal Welfare Intergroup Vice President Petras Austrevicius and will be moderated by the Telegraph Brussels correspondent James Crisp. And finally, within a few weeks, Eurogroup for Animals will hold a webinar on the negotiations between EU and Australia. And they will talk mainly about the commercial kangaroo hunting. This event will raise the issue of animal welfare in these negotiations and will see the launch of the report Australia EU Trade in Products Derived from Commercial Kangaroo Hunting. This webinar will be hosted by the new Intergroup member, Manuela Ripa, and myself. The meeting time has still to be fixed, but we will inform you soon about the timing of this event. And for more information about these events, you can of course contact the Eurogroup, the Intergroup Secretariat, I have to say. Then an update on the members who left the Animal Welfare Intergroup and those who recently joined. Intergroup's former Vice President, Klaus Bruchner, had left the European Parliament. And also the EP Vice President, Mairead McGuinness, who has become the EU Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union, has left the European Parliament and the Intergroup recently. But there's also good news. Since July, 4 new MEPs have joined the Intergroup, and these are Thomas Weitz from Austria, Manuela Ripa from Germany, Anna de Parnay Grunenberg, also from Germany, and Alexis Georgoulis from Greece. And I would like to welcome Thomas, Manuela, Anna, and Alexis. That means that currently the Animal Welfare Intergroup has 93 members, and all political groups and almost all member states are represented. with the exception of Hungary, Latvia, and Slovenia. Finally, some housekeeping rules to ensure a smooth running of this session. We're having 3 guest speakers today, and after each presentation, MEPs have the opportunity to raise urgent questions. However, keep in mind that the main debate will be about all issues raised during the meeting. It will take place during the last 30 minutes of this session. If you want to speak up or if you have a comment, please use the chat box, which Reineke and Andreas of Eurogroup for Animals will monitor. And we will come back to you when our guests have finished their presentations. We also invite attendees who have a comment. Please use the Twitter to post your questions. So that's for attendees following the Facebook Live meeting. You can do so by tweeting your question and using the username of the intergroup, which is @AW-Intergroup. And we will make a selection of those questions, and Reineke will come in and pose these to our experts. So now let's go to the official part of the debate today. What is at stake for animals and the environment in the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement? The EU-Mercosur Agreement, as it stands now, raises major concerns for the welfare of people, animals, and the planet. If ratified, the agreement will generate, further stimulate, and fuel the intensification of animal agriculture in export-oriented sectors, both in the EU, especially dairy and pig meat, and in the Mercosur countries, especially beef and chicken meat. In addition to being intrinsically detrimental to animal welfare, the intensification of animal agriculture is seriously contributing to the 3 key challenges the planet is facing: zoonosis, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change. And across Europe, several voices have been raised against the ratification of this text as it stands. In Austria, for instance, the current government included in its coalition program not to ratify the deal following a resolution of the national parliament. In Ireland and the Netherlands, the national parliaments also adopted a resolution calling their governments not to ratify. In Belgium, the situation is similar due to the adoption of such resolutions in the regional parliaments of Brussels and Wallonia. And in neighboring countries, the trend is the same. While President Macron has already expressed criticism against this agreement several times, the German Chancellor recently expressed serious doubts about the deforestation this trade deal could lead to. So let's see what our experts and guest speakers have to say about this. Let's start with the first speaker. It is an honor to have Professor Olivier de Schutter here with us today, who is co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He will raise the many concerns over ratification of the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. Professor de Schutter, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Anya, for this introduction and for setting the stage so well about this discussion. I would like to essentially highlight what I see as the major issues, problems raised by the agreement, and which explain the positions adopted by the various parliamentary assemblies that you mentioned, and by various governments, including most recently the French government, as you rightly mentioned. And in fact, if you look at the EU-Mercosur trade agreements, at least the parts we know about and have been published, I think it's fair to say that we can identify 6 major problems with the agreement as it is. The first problem is related to what you just mentioned, which is deforestation. Now, the agreement has one chapter, chapter 14, on trade and sustainable development. These TSD chapters have become very standard in the trade agreements negotiated by the EU. However, the chapter has a separate dispute settlement and enforcement mechanism, separate from the rest of the agreement and less binding, less constraining than the rest of the agreement. Moreover, the sustainable development commitments included in chapter 14 are very vague and in fact not really enforceable as a result. It's also very narrowly defined. For example, the provisions on the forests refer to illegal logging, but do not refer to the problem resulting from soybean, from beef production, from sugar production grown on illegally deforested land. Finally, if a state lowers its environmental protections, this will not be considered to have violated the terms of the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter unless it can be proven, but that's very difficult to show, that this violation of environmental standards was meant to strengthen the competitiveness of the party concerned. Finally, let me add on this chapter that there is a reference to the precautionary principle. It is stated that each party may apply that precautionary principle, but only to protect against potential harm in its own territory. In other terms, the EU may not invoke the precautionary principle in order to question choices made in the production methods in Brazil or Argentina, for example. So that is, I think, a first major concern raised by the agreement. It is that the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, chapter 14, is very weak, basically not enforceable, and has a very narrow scope in comparison to the reality of the problems that we face with this agreement. A second problem has to do with climate change, and this again, Anya, is something you referred to. Clearly, the agreement is meant to increase the possibilities for Brazil, Argentina in particular, to sell beef, industrially produced beef to the EU, and allowing the EU to sell more cars to the 4 countries of the Mercosur. Now, this will have major climate implications, increasing greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the stimulus to production this will represent. There are no clear assessments about this, or rather the assessments are not always consistent with one another. But for example, the NGO Grain has considered that this would result in 9 million additional tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year to be emitted. 9 million tons is about what a large city such as Belo Horizonte with 3.9 million inhabitants emits each year. So there shall be a significant increase of greenhouse gas emissions resulting from this increased stimulation of production resulting from the deal that is now pending approval ratification. The third problem has to do with, indeed, the very weak provisions concerning animal welfare standards. Now, there is something in the EU-Mercosur agreement concerning shell eggs, and that is the sole mention of animal welfare standards in that agreement, but that is all we have. And it is grossly insufficient. In fact, during the negotiations, 12 member states, Austria, Belgium, France, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Latvia, Luxembourg, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia demanded from the Commission that it do more and that it impose non-tariff conditions linked to animal welfare on its counterpart. This was not taken into account, and nor were the requests from these states that the use of pesticides in the countries from which the EU would import should be better monitored, or that more generally environmental standards be strengthened. So in other terms, we have very few safeguards, and I shall return to the question of pesticides in a minute, but I think that is a third major concern. A fourth concern has to do with the fact that the trade deal will make it more difficult to make a transition to sustainable agroecological food systems. In fact, what the deal will result in is to encourage Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay to develop more intensive agricultural practices in the form of monocultures that produce large volumes for exports at the expense of any environmental standards that still are in place today. And for example, we know that the government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil has repealed the sugarcane agroecological zoning regulation, which was a regulation that prohibited the planting of sugarcane in areas of natural vegetation. And this is the kind of dismantling of environmental protections for the sake of exporting more that we will see more of in the next few years should the deal go ahead. I should say that in the EU itself, it may be more difficult to justify imposing on farmers stringent environmental standards if we expose these very same farmers to unfair competition from abroad, to environmental dumping as a result of a weak monitoring of the conditions in which the agricultural products we import in the EU are produced. So that's a fourth problem. It is simply not compatible with the Green Deal, with the narrative about ecological transition in the EU to strike such a trade agreement. The fifth issue has to do with public health and more precisely the use of pesticides. Now, let us remember that just after China and the US, Brazil and Argentina are the two countries with the highest use of pesticides in the world. And the irony of the situation is that many of these pesticides used in Brazil and Argentina are sold to these countries by EU-based companies. In fact, Eurostat reported that in the years 2015, 2019, an average of 56,000 tons of pesticides per year were sold to the Mercosur countries by European companies. In 2018, the share of EU companies in the pesticide markets in the Mercosur was about 19% in terms of value. What is really very troubling to me, and I suppose to all defenders of the environment, is that we are selling to Brazil, to Argentina, to the Mercosur countries, we are selling pesticides that in some cases are prohibited from being used in Europe because they are considered to be carcinogenous or to be damaging for health. And indeed, we know that the use of pesticides in a country such as Brazil has significant impacts on the population. Some 7,000 people in Brazil died from pesticides use between 2008 and 2017. So we sell to Brazil and Argentina pesticides that we cannot use here, and then we import from Brazil and Argentina agricultural commodities that have been using these very same pesticides that have been deemed to be dangerous to human health. And to me, that is certainly a very shocking discovery. The sixth issue I'd like to highlight briefly concerns the basic requirement that trade agreements do not undermine, but rather support human rights. Now, we know that as a result of the conflicts over land use, particularly in Brazil, violence has increased in the Amazonian frontier. Farm workers are exploited, exposed to pesticides. Indigenous communities living in the forests are being moved away in order to allow the forest to be cleared down. And unfortunately, there is no human rights clause in the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, although such a human rights clause is normally a standard feature of trade agreements in the EU. At least the elements of the agreements that have to date been published do not contain such a human rights clause. And it is therefore extremely problematic that we will not be able to suspend the working of the trade deal, even if it is found that human rights violations have taken place, for example, as a result of land conflicts increasing due to export-led deforestation and cultivation. So these are, in my view, the 6 major problems of the EU-Mercosur agreement, but I'm delighted that many parliaments have expressed very strong reservations, and that governments are now understanding that it is not compatible with the commitments we make within the Paris Agreement, with the adoption of the Green Deal, with the farm to fork strategy announced in May of this year. It is not compatible with all these commitments to negotiate trade deals of the 20th century that are really not at all conducive to sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor De Schutter, for your presentation. It's quite shocking to hear all these details and numbers all summed up. Reineke, do we have questions from the MEPs?
Thank you, Anja. We have not received any questions from the MEPs. I think that everyone is very impressed by Professor De Schutter's very clear presentation, very also shocking presentation, I would say. We do have a question from the audience, because someone asked via Twitter if you, Professor De Schutter, believe that coupling non-trade conditions such as animal welfare to tariffs could be a solution to get things right. And this has also been called for by the Dutch and the French government in their joint position paper recently. So do you think that such mechanisms could help us to get this deal right? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry, thank you. No, it's important to realize that today, the unions, the NGOs, the social movements in the Mercosur countries feel betrayed. For them, the EU-Mercosur agreement is a threat, and they do not understand why the EU can pretend to pursue in its international relations certain values listed in Article 2 of the EU Treaty without really taking these values into account in the negotiation of this trade deal. And they understand, as I think we all do, that to negotiate a trade agreement with complete disregard for environmental sustainability, human rights, the rights of farm workers, and the rights of the populations affected by pesticide use is making it far more difficult for these groups in the countries where they are to fight for sustainable development, because they feel that the EU is rewarding practices that they themselves are trying to challenge. So to do this, to raise tariffs, or even to impose bans on imports when the agricultural products are either unhealthy and contaminated by pesticides, or violating animal welfare standards, or result from deforestation, or result in human rights violations, including farm workers' rights violations. I think all this is not protectionism. It is supporting the fight of social movements, NGOs, unions in the global South. And it is protecting those values. It is making it easier and more plausible to make an ecological and social transition within the EU itself.
Many thanks for this very clear answer. A follow-up question to this is then, many member states are now working on developing protocols, as they did for the EU-CETA trade deal, to mend things. Do you think that this could work eventually? Or do you believe the EU needs to rethink its trade policy and the way it wants also to pursue these trade agreements with other countries? So should the Commission go back to the drawing table, or maybe even make this part of a broader discussion about the future of our trade policies?
Look, historically speaking, trade agreements were seen as a means to grow the economy, to increase export opportunities, and sustainable development was not at all at the heart of those objectives or those preoccupations. But the result of this is that it has become much more difficult to move to a more sustainable type of development, both because we reward export-led policies in the countries from which we import, and because within the EU, we expose our own producers to unfair competition from abroad, to social dumping, to environmental dumping, making it very difficult for us to justify imposing on our producers in the EU more stringent standards. So unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we must accept that trade deals must be designed to support sustainable development, not simply growth, because otherwise we're actually undermining our possibility to move to a more sustainable pathway. So in my view, the real problem is that we've not seen trade agreements as a tool to support the sustainable development goals. We've seen them simply as a tool to increase the volume of exports, imports, the volumes traded, without seeing that this would be encouraging the champions of global trade, which are the big transnational corporations, allowing them to practice social, environmental dumping, and indeed, given that these trade agreements have investment chapters often included in them, fiscal dumping. So I think it's much more serious than just more standards or more safeguards having to be introduced. It is the very philosophy of an export-driven model of growth that I believe we must question today.
Many thanks, Professor De Schutter. It seems, Anja, that a more fundamental debate would be required to get this right about the future of how we trade and our economic model. I'm sure we will discuss more about this later on, but I would like to hand over back to you to introduce our next speaker, Anja.
Well, thank you, Reineke, and thank you again, Professor De Schutter, for your presentation. Now I'd like to warmly welcome our second speaker of today, Mr. Gabriel Kaznaty, who is a fiscal jurist and trade coordinator at the Regional Brazil Office of Public Services International. He will in particularly raise the concerns over an inclusive and sustainable development which arise from the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. Please, Mr. Kaznaty, unmute yourself and the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Anja. Thank you so much for the organizers. And my name is Gabriel Kaznaty. I work currently in Public Service International as a tax and trade coordinator, and very excellent and very didactic presentation by Professor Oliver, which one I totally agree. And I will add a Brazilian youth and perspective from the Mercosur to this excellent presentation from Professor Oliver. And can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as everyone knows, the top exported products between the EU and Mercosur shows a huge inequality between the origin of these products, and Mercosur is acting such as the farm of the world, exporting commodities in a huge quantity to the European Union even before the agreement. And as everyone knows, the agreement it's very focused in increasing these exportations from the agribusiness in the Mercosur to the European Union. That's no secret from anyone. And grain estimates shows how the commodities included in the agreement will impact the environment, exclusively the ethanol, the raw sugarcane, soybean, rice, and especially poultry, and the top the top commodity in the Mercosur, the beef, will rise at 15% at least. So At the same time, we don't have any transparency, enforcement, or inclusion, as Professor Oliver was saying. Last week, recent Oxford and Nature Conservancy research concluded that in the first place, they hadn't any inclusion from civil society or any transparency for traceability requirements for high-risk products, or any inclusion of indigenous communities, or any consultations with opposition parties or other parts interested in the Mercosur. So, and there is no legal binding safeguards or for mitigating sustainability impacts. And nowadays, even before the agreement, the European Union imports from Mercosur results in one football field of deforestation each 3 minutes. So the European Union are already involved in deforestation in Latin America, exclusively in the Mercosur, and as grain were estimating, this number will raise based in the new quotas in the agreement. So the EU-Mercosur agreement fail across sustainability criteria, and it stands in that direct contradiction with the goals of the European Green New Deal, because there are only recommendations and no binding legal commitments in these agreements. By another hand, the European Union already has a lot of free trade agreements between Latin America countries. These are the dates of the entry into force of each agreement. And using a case example of Colombia, by example, the Colombian government has a policy towards increasing mining and energy exports, and used the agreement to reach these objectives. So after 7 years of the agreement, what we can see that the European Union failed to control the CO2 emissions and failed to control the sustainable impacts of the products imported from Colombia. And after 7 years, the foreign investments of the EU increased in Colombia, but increased mainly in coal, palm oil, and mining industries. And these agreements didn't lead to any monitoring or research impacts of the EU investments in Colombia. So what we can see to this point is that the FTA between EU and Mercosur will increase deforestation and CO2 emissions as soybeans and beef exports will increase. And both beef and soybeans are responsible for more than 75% of deforestation in Brazil. The second fact is the FTA EU-Mercosur has no legal binding safeguards on environmental or animal welfare, only weak recommendations. And the third fact is in recent similar free trade agreements along Latin America countries, the EU has been failing to control environmental crimes involving their exportations, or are failing also to monitor or develop research or tracing their exportations origins. So based on these facts, the question is not if the free trade agreements between EU and Mercosur will harm environment and animals, but how much and how it can impact. And based in this current text and recent experience, we can say that how the FTA will harm the environment depends only and exclusively on the local governments. So the EU has no control on the origin of its exports, has no control on the impact of its investments. So that's where we reach Brazil. Brazil is Mercosur's largest economy, its largest population, largest area. It corresponds to more than 3/4 of the entire economy of the bloc, so it's the most important country. And in Brazilian situation, as everyone probably knows, are very disappointing at this point, and they are playing completely against any environmental policy. Bolsonaro's government defends openly the regulation of environmental protection, is strongly supported by the agribusiness, by the beef, bullet, and Bible parliamentaries, the 3 Bs, which supported him to be elected, and he denies scientific evidence of global climate change openly. That's not a secret for anyone. And his main policies are decrease the budget of several Brazilian environmental public bodies, the number of notifications and the bills who the the government are issuing to people who are putting fire in the forest are the lowest number in the history of Brazil. Brazilian environmental public bodies lacks autonomy for the first time since democracy. Bolsonaro denies Brazilian public body statistics and are threatening public employees and censoring access to information and censoring free speech of media of making these numbers public. Bolsonaro government incentives illegal exploitation of indigenous and environmental protection areas. One of his main policies is to open these environmental protection areas to free economic exploitation. He gives direct government support for illegal miners in the Amazon rainforest as a form of occupation in the borders. And he broke all the records for the approval of pesticides. Since the change of government in 2016, and especially after his election, the number raised to a new level. And only this year during the pandemic, he approved more than 200 pesticides. And as I wrote in the chat, between August 2019 and August 2020, he approved more than 600 new pesticides, which are leading, between other things, the death of dozens of millions of bees all over the country and other deep consequences to the environment. So, based on his policies, what is happening in Brazil, it's only a consequence. It's not very surprising, and it's not also very surprising because he was announcing all these policies even before he was elected. So one thing we cannot criticize Bolsonaro is to lie about these issues, because it was very clear about his intention since the beginning. So last year we had like this global story on the Amazon rainforest fires. It's happening again this year, but last year it got more public attention all over the world. These are some news headlines. The first one is from 2020 that says that deforestation in Amazon registers the worst August month in 10 years. The other is from Deutsche Welle from last year, which says that deforestation in Amazon raised 85% in 2019. And the other articles, it's more about the animal life threatening in the Amazon related to the fire as the endangered species, and the most accurate estimates on the animal deaths in the Amazon. It came from the Bolivian part of the Amazon, which was very, which more than 2 million animals died last year during the fire season in the Bolivian side of the border, which produced heartbreaking pictures and heartbreaking numbers about the animal diversity and the plants diversity in the region. These are some pictures from the last year. In the right, you can see some of the animals in the Amazon, and in the left side, the consequence of the fire in the Bolivian side of the Amazon, near the border of Brazil. And this year again, all the story are repeating all over again with the Brazilian wetlands, Brazilian Pantanal, which are in the middle of the soybean frontier of the agribusiness in Brazil. And the fire is happening right now as consequence of climate change, as the drought season is the biggest in decades, but it was deliberately started by farmers supported by the government, and these deliberately fires, it's registering the record deforestation in the Brazilian history of this biome. It's destroyed more than all the years combined, only 2020, and only in 2020, Brazil lost 15 of the entire wetland biome with fires deliberately started by farmers, supported by the government, and with the default of the public regulatory agencies. We don't have the very good estimates on animals loss, and you don't have the open access to the press as in former years. So this is happening, and lots of the information we receive here in Brazil came from international media, and sometimes came from media in the other side of the border in Paraguay or in Bolivia. And these fires threatens endangered species. We can see in the picture species such as the capybara, the jaguar, the maned wolf, the blue macaw. But all over again, based on the government's decisions, the pictures and the scenes we are seeing in the wetlands right now are this one, are total desperation and fire consuming the most important national parks and the most important protected areas in the country. So Brazil is going through its worst environmental and institutional crisis since democracy consolidation in the late 80s. The FTA benefits mainly the agribusiness in the Mercosur country, and the agribusiness are directly responsible for deforestation and loss of animal life. Don't forget that in the Amazon fires last year, it was estimated that 3/4 of the fires were in properties of agribusiness lands dedicated for cattle and for soybeans. As we saw, the agreement text doesn't have any legal binding mechanisms to regulate, monitor, or avoid illegal deforestation. And in the same way, recent agreements with Mercosur and European Union and Latin America countries shows that Europe are failing to address its investments into sustainable energy, or to monitor or trace the origin of its imports from Latin America countries. And so for the EU, the signing of the FTA EU-Mercosur under this text and context by a Mercosur perspective means to legitimate Brazilian government pro-deforestation policies. It's not that is omitting policies to combat deforestation, but he supports openly deforestation. It will legitimate the legal fires, the legal exploitation and mining in protected areas and indigenous protected areas that are the biggest environmental areas in Brazil. And it will contradict the EU New Green Deal, as the Professor Oliver exposed. And lastly, and I think it can be a little bit harsh, but I think it's now what is this debate between European governments. The signing of this text will make the EU accountable for an ecocide. And as the Professor Oliver were telling us, it's the structure, it's the ideology, that's the format of the agreement. Of course, the text is very bad and the text can be improved, but under these conditions, with the objective of benefiting the agribusiness and with the free trade agreement mentality, we cannot reach a point where these terms of sustainability and animal welfare can be binding legal rights. So we not only need to change the text, but also to address and contest the European Union structure of trade agreements, because we know all the contradictions inside the European Union, but at the same time, with governments such as in Brazil and in the US, we know that the European Union, even with all the problems, are the most democratic and consolidated institutionally economic bloc in the world. So we depend on the European Union to change this logic and to change the framework of the trade agreements to be a standard, a positive standard to the road on the sustainable economy, not to be this kind of standard which develops and improves the ability of farmers and the government of exploiting and abuse and make this ecocide in the Amazon, in Brazilian savanna and Brazilian wetlands. So I have here the sources to share with everyone. If you want to know more about some data from Brazil, all of this was based on recent numbers. So you can talk with me. I will share some of the material. Part of them are in Portuguese, part of them are in English. Sorry about my English. I would love to speak it better right now, but it's 5 a.m. in Brazil, and my head is not in the same mood right now. So thank you so much for the attention, and also if you want, you can share this presentation with everyone. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel. And your English was not so bad. We could follow everything you said. And it is really heartbreaking to see how all these invaluable ecosystems, the forests, the wetlands, are being destroyed by humans, and just for mainly for agriculture. And well, it's heartbreaking. Reineke, I guess we have some questions from the audience or MEPs.
Yes, thank you, Anja. And indeed, this was a very strong expose from you, Gabriel, because often the Commission pretends that this trade deal is a good thing for civil society in the Mercosur countries, and that we can help you to raise your standards. And I think that MEP Eleonora Evi also has a question related to this. Eleonora, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, Reineke. And thanks a lot for these two interventions. Actually, I have to say, I am speechless. And it is all very sad and very heartbreaking. There should be, and there would be so many things to say on all these issues, but really what struck me so much is the enormous quantity of arguments that we have to say no to this deal, and still things continue to go ahead, because today, for example, actually yesterday, the European Commission authorized a new GMOs to the European market, and it is a soybean, and we all know from where these soybeans usually comes from, and the European Commission continues to authorize in the European market the use of these products. Despite all the scientific information we have, despite the European Parliament continue to oppose these authorizations. Since last term, it is more than 40 objections we made in the European Parliament without any results. The European Commission goes on and authorize these new GMOs in the markets, in the European markets. And we all know that soy is one of the driven for deforestation. So it's crystal clear we have to stop these insane trade of commodities. And the news that Brazil just authorized 600 pesticides, it's really shocking. But my questions would be more related to the role of civil society, because here, as you were all saying, there's criticism raising upon this trade agreement, but unfortunately, we don't hear enough about the public debate in Brazil and other Mercosur countries concerning this trade agreement. So I was hoping you can tell us more about it. What are the civil society organizations doing that are leading this fight against the EU-Mercosur agreement? I mean, is there, I guess, a movement, and what we can do as an MEPs here in the European Parliament to help them? Thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora. It's a very important question. Like, starting by the public debate, like Brazil has a different public debate from the other countries, because Brazil, after the Workers' Party term, we didn't sign any free trade agreements in our history. We started to sign the first one with Chile after the Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016. We signed it with Chile in 2018. So the public debate in Brazil has been frozen since the negotiations of the FTA along the US in the 90s. So public debates are not very developed in Brazil, and civil society in Brazil is not very aware of these facts. So till now, it was not very widely spoken in the press, and the press had a consensual narrative that it would modernize Brazilian economy and it would be important to put Brazilian economy in the 21st century. And the European Union, it's a very developed bloc with consolidated democracy. So people from almost all over the political spectrum were approving this agreement because we didn't have any public debate on this issue, because it was frozen, the debate on the FTAs, because we never had an FTA in Brazil. And European Union is very well seen by everyone because it's developed and has institutions, consolidated institutions. So the public debate it's very weak in Brazil. In all the other countries, it's a little bit more developed once these countries are more inserted into the FTA's route in the last decade. So civil society and opposition parties are more aware about what it means to sign free trade agreements. So at the press level, we have this consensual narrative of modernizing Latin America and modernizing our economic relations. And regarding to the civil society, we have an interesting articulation in Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, countries that are more involved in this issue. And in Brazil, we are starting to have more articulation between the no-land workers, the trade unions, and NGOs. So for the first time since I started to work with this issue, we had a recent meeting 2 weeks ago with more than 50 organizations and civil society organizations in Brazil to discuss this free trade agreement. And it was probably the first time it's happened since the negotiations with the US in the late 90s. So at this point, we are trying to convince the opposition party, because as you know, in Brazil, we have a very liberal in economy and conservative in politics government. So we are raising awareness in the opposition bloc that is this agreement will lead to all these consequences, and the environmental issues are the one which are raising more awareness in parliamentarians and in the public debate. So at this point, we are in Brazil with this articulation of more than 50 organizations. Most part of them doesn't have a deep knowledge on this issue, because as I said, we weren't worried about free trade agreements for the last couple of decades. So I think the most important thing right now, it would be to set an open meeting with representatives from the European Union to expose your side and expose also former experience of EU agreements with Latin America and developing countries. It would be fantastic to raise awareness in this group. And also thinking a little bit forward, but to thinking about European parliamentarians, it would be amazing to have a joint conversation with some opposition leaders in Brazil, because they are not very sensitive to this issue, and civil society doesn't have this so close link with them. So yes, I think the impact assessment that you already developed, it would be amazing. So we could think in translating some documents to Portuguese and based on these documents to suggest meetings with opposition, parliamentarians, members, and representatives in Brazil to insert them again in this international debate and go further on this discussion. So in the media, we have this consensual narrative. In civil society, we don't have a very developed policy. We don't have a very developed articulation, but it is starting in Brazil for the first time. After decades, it's crucial to raise awareness in parliamentarians. I think this must be our focus, especially in Brazil and Argentina. And at the Mercosur level, we have the platform Latin America Better Without Free Trade Agreements, which I'm part of. And they are developing and working very with impact assessments, raising awareness in Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina especially. So I think Brazil, it would be the focus, not only because of the environmental impacts of this government, but also as the biggest partner and the last developed internal debates among the media, among social organizations.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this very comprehensive explanation about the situation in your country. And there's a lot for us to follow up on also after this meeting, I'm sure. Before I hand back to you, Anja, to introduce our next speaker, I would like to see if MEP Bagan is also with us and would like to take the floor and share her views about the situation also as member of the Committee on International Trade in the Parliament. If not, then I suggest we come back to MEP Bagan later when we have more time for the debate. And then I hand over back to you, Anja, to introduce our next speaker, please.
Well, thank you, Reineke. Yes, our next speaker is a colleague of us, a member of the European Parliament, Anna de Parnay-Grunenberg, who will explain more about the European Parliament's involvement in the ratification process of the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. Anna, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clearly. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much. So thank you very much and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to the Intergroup for Animal Welfare as a speaker and to discuss about the Mercosur Agreement, the role of the European Parliament, and more about the involvement and the process and what it would mean for animal welfare at the end. So I can share you a state I am now. The agreement is currently going through legal scrubbing. That's a little bit technical. Does this mean exactly the technical legal details are being clarified now? After that, it will be translated and sent to the Council and to the European Parliament, to us as MEPs for approval. And you can follow the step in the involvement of the European Parliament in this chart. That's done by the organization FERN, really involved in forest and human rights protection. Our fear as Greens, and my personal fear, is that the EU Commission thinks of having a blind declaration in order to be able to go ahead with the deal anyway, in response to the international and global outrage to the fires, the deforestation, and the awful climate policy of President Bolsonaro in Brazil, as we heard before. What we ask for now are far-reaching reforms in Mercosur, because a non-binding action plan or a declaration on the side of Mercosur countries, especially from Brazil, will not be enough to get us on board with the EU-Mercosur deal. There is too much involved and yes, too high possible damage. Under a normal scenario, if the European Union proceeds is a usual way, let's say, the agreement would require unanimous voting in Council and approval by all national parliaments. One procedural move that makes us very concerned about is that the Commission might propose to split the agreement into two parts. Then the trade deal would be separated for the broader political cooperation and dialogue part, where everybody thinks that we can put some sustainable development in. In that case, the trade part would only need a qualified majority in the Council and would not need to be ratified by national parliaments. And you can imagine how controversial this would be, since if it is split, then surely the deal is going ahead. Whereas if it's not split, then we have a good chance that it will not pass, given resistance from several countries. So the Parliament, therefore, is now still in a position of waiting and trying to influence the possible outcomes of the agreement. So thank you for this meeting today. It is also in our interest that the agreement is not being split. Yeah, you can see on the last slide, we have it now, that scientific research has tried to predict what the agreement would mean for our market. It seems impossible to combine high animal welfare standards with the Mercosur trade agreement as it is now. The higher imports of cheap meat will, of course, put even more pressure on the farmers in the EU that are, yeah, to be clear, already struggling to combine the demand for affordable meat and the official requirements for animal welfare. We know that the system is not really good in Europe, but if we have a kind of same pressure, doing more concurrence from the Mercosur is going to be worse. So I'm happy to discuss with you all the possibility for handling as MEPs and how we can proceed in the future. For me, how we treat animals as a society is really a yardstick of our humanity and our civilization. So I hope that we will measure ourselves by it and be really clear that we need change in the Mercosur agreement, and that we want to keep pressure and not to see on one hand just the trade deal and the other hand all those things that make our civilization so so important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for your explanation. Reineke, are there any questions to Anna specifically related to the ratification process of the Mercosur EU Free Trade Agreement, or maybe for one of the other speakers?
Yes, thank you, Anja. There is a question indeed from the public following via Facebook Live for MEP de Parny-Grunenberg. The question is, are you working in the entire committee on a list of preconditions to ratify the deal? Are you looking at such a list, and what would these preconditions consist of?
Okay, actually, I'm not in the Inter committee, but I know they are working on preconditions. And of course, the main would be that the conditions should be reforms in the Mercosur country themselves. That would be the highest standard, because so we are sure that they are applying their own rule and we know them, and so we can have a fair deal. On the other hand, other parties or groups are speaking about other preconditions, but I'm not able to do it here. I am in the Trend Committee and in the Agri Committee, so really related to this basic description of the deal that we want to sell cars and we want to buy cows. So I am a Tran in the Agri, but I'm not in the Inter. But we are following that really close. But now it's not so the first focus on the precondition, because we just really want to take the agreement, like I explained, as a whole. And that the dialogue part, the political part, and the trade keep together. That's really the strong step we need to do. When we're separating it and doing some weak conditions or preconditions, it will be really, really damage for animal welfare and for environmental purposes.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. Perhaps MEP Bagan is with us, who is member of the Inter committee, and she could say a bit more about possible preconditions.
About Inter committee, the situation is not so clear at the moment about this issue, and I can explain my position first of all. So first of all, for who don't know me already, I'm the head of the 5-star delegation in European Parliament, and of course, as I'm working in Inter committee, I'm responsible for trade dossier of my delegation. And my position, my stance of the past big dossier of the Inter committee has been, to put it gently, criticizing. But I've always been open to trade and the benefits it entails for export-oriented economies like ours. But most often I have opposed trade agreement like CETA or TTIP, for example, and but I didn't eat for economic reason. I don't doubt that many of these agreements and even Mercosur may be economical advantages, but their impact on social rights, environment, and animal rights have been consistently downplayed and systematically excluded from the calculation of this agreement on people's health here in Europe has always been our primary concern. And we, alongside with many civil society organizations, have been accused of waving the flag of people's health under false pretenses. As you might remember, I raised some of these concerns with CETA 3 years ago, but I was not listened to. And in the meanwhile, the Commission has confirmed that some hormone-free beef from Canada have indeed reached the Union, and we have no way of tracking it down. Similarly to CETA, of course, Mercosur has been on our radar for quite some time, especially for its impact on people's health, animal welfare, and of course, environment. And as other people said, other speakers said, Mercosur represents already 43% of total EU meat imports, even without trade preferences. Beef from Mercosur countries alone accounts 75% of all EU imported beef, and South America poultry makes 44%, almost half of all the imported poultry in the Europe. In one of the last plenaries we had in Strasbourg, it was December, I think, we were discussing the compatibility of Mercosur with the European Green Deal. What I said essentially was that I don't know what kind of evidence is needed to understand that the agreement will have a heavy and negative impact on environment. Just as Mr. Kaznaty pointed out before, the fires we saw in this summer were not accidental. They were aimed to creating new land for cultivation and above all pastures, which alone is responsible for 80% of all deforestation in the Amazon. And of course, deforestation isn't this deal only environmental problem. We know that there are no limits or precise sanctions for the use of pesticides in agriculture and for fish exploitation, especially in Argentina, in Uruguay, or the mismanagement of water resources, for example, as occurs in Paraguay and Uruguay. So I concluded at that time my speech with a very simple question. What is the point of telling our producer to pollute less and to force them to respect extremely high standards when their competitors in the world do not have to do the same? What is the point of limiting emissions in Europe if then we incentivize emission elsewhere? The same is true for animal health and welfare. We Europeans are still a long way from a society that respects farm animals and treat them with dignity, but we have made progresses. The same cannot be said elsewhere in the world. Regulation on animal health in the Mercosur countries is often voluntary, or when it is compulsory, it is insufficiently enforced, leaving room for misinterpretation or violation. Brazilian NGOs have estimated that billions of animals die in a cruel manner in Brazil each year, while an official report added that up to 10% of Brazilian facilities do not respect EU safety standards. Similarly, EU audits uncovered shortcomings in Argentina's slaughterhouses. My point is that we are not just turning a blind eye to all this suffering, but we are actively contributing to its increase. What's even worse, in my opinion, is that once the deal enters into force, it will create even more competition between EU and South American meat producers, resulting in a downward pressure that will reduce compliance to EU animal welfare standards in the best case, and maybe even reduce the quality of future legislation in the years to come. And animals will pay the price in the end. So I think this is an injustice that we need to stop. The key will be checks and controls. But here again, I am afraid we do not see the improvement we hoped for. For example, some chapters of the agreements like the trading goods and the sanitary and phytosanitary chapters constrains EU action in this regard, explicitly limiting customs and quality controls on meat imports. This is worrisome because it adds to the many deficiencies that we suffer from here in the customs union. In fact, one of my key contributions during the past legislature was an inter-resolution on the lack of the uniformity of customs control in the EU. This was the first EU document to denounce the difference in quantity and quality of customs controls in European Union, and saying out loud that some custom authorities are turning a blind eye to certain goods, and importers know it. And they are becoming more and more prone to pot shopping. The same has been shown also by the Court of Auditors of the EU. And you know that once you have made it to an entry point in the Union, you almost do not face any additional control. So controls needs to be more efficient and targeted, not less frequent. But this agreement is not going in the right direction here. So I do not want to take up too much time. But let me finish saying that in the 5-star movement, we are well aware of the risk of this agreement, both here in the European Parliament and in the Italian government. Of course, we know, we believe that trade is essential and Latin America represents a strategic partner for Europe, but it cannot come at the expense of citizens and the protection of environment and animals. So we cannot outsource pollution, and most of all, we cannot outsource animal suffering. We need to end them right away, both in Europe and everywhere else. So this is our position. About my colleagues, so the question was about the socialists. I think that there is a lot of confusion now. All the big parties, the big European group in the hemicycle are not yet sure of the position. I think there are so many divisions also by the governments. We saw different declarations also during the summer. I remember Macron, I remember Merkel also, that were very criticizing some aspects. So I think that we cannot give a quite fixed answer to this question.
Many thanks for your very passionate speech here, Mrs. Bangen.
Thanks to you.
It's very clear that the MEPs who intervened today do not see any prospect in improving the current trade deal. What several people in the audience would like to know is, how do you think that this process will continue? What is needed to provide the various political groups with the information on which basis they can take an informed decision and they can send this trade agreement back to the Commission and make it part of a more fundamental debate about the future of trade policy in the EU? What do you think is required at this moment?
I think that information is always the key word, and but unfortunately, I think that COVID put a very big challenge. I remember that for CETA, for TTIP, we had a very big discussion, a big involvement of civil society, lot of debate in presence, for example, everywhere in Italy and everywhere in Europe. For Mercosur, I think that the voice hasn't raised enough for by the time. The debate is not so felt by MEP, and I think that we do not talk about this issue. So I think I thank you again for this occasion. That I think it could be a very good manner to develop the debate, to increase the participation of citizens. But in any case, what I see for the approving, I think that every MEP would like to see the enforceable commitment of the environment. This is I think a key point. What will happen in the next 2 months? I can't say. I say that the key points that I think it could be important to have an approval is by one side, as I said, the commitment of with sanction for the environment and animal welfare, of course, and from the other side, the reduction of meat quotas that personally I believe is really too high. And this is also a key point from an economical point of view, because what I learned in my experience is that we need to have also the position of the producer. And in that case, for Europe, I think that the competition is not fair, and maybe also the reduction of meat quota could be something that is good for producers, and so also the other parties, the families who are more concerned for economical reason, maybe could have the same position we have in that case.
Many thanks for
Thanks
this,
to you.
for this advice. We have another question for Gabriel, please, because Gabriel, only last week we heard that GBS, the largest meat processing company in the world based in Brazil, has launched a new program, corporate social responsibility program. It's called Together for the Amazon, and it's using modern technology to make sure that the soy they source is not coming from areas where there are huge problems in terms of deforestation. What do you think of such initiatives, and do you believe that the EU-Mercosur trade deal and the big controversy around that may have incentivized this company to now really also make this step?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, because we have now this idea of a corporate responsibility among the huge agribusiness players in Brazil. So nowadays, it's said that the very huge agribusiness players are against the fires in the wetlands, are against the fires in the Amazon, because these fires makes the Brazilian economy further than to reach new markets, such as in the FTA with the Mercosur. So there is this idea that the huge agribusiness are not supporting these small players' actions of putting fire in the Amazon forest. But in reality, JBS are related to the worst corruption scandals in Brazilian history, and they are involved with each government who are in power in Brazil. It's not a question of ideology, but they are part of every government in Brazil, funding directly, indirectly, legally, illegally, political campaigns and other kinds of political lobby. So they are a very huge player. They have almost a monopoly of these markets in Brazil, and they already destroyed, and they own a huge part of the lands and helps with the CO2 emissions. So I'm not saying they are directly involved in the fires, but we cannot also trace 100% of its production by one hand, and by another hand is they are already one of the most pollutive industries in the world. So the strategy is not only, okay, they are not involved in the fire, but they are involved in destruction of the environment even without putting any fire. So the idea is not to incentivize, like, these industries is the most supported industry in Brazilian history, with subsidies, with trade agreements, with subside to exportations, help to exportation. So, and in my point of view, more than accusing them of being involved or not, they are in fact one of the most hazardous industries for animals and for the population in the world. So the idea is not to boost their power, is not to boost their exportations, but in reality to lower it down and to weaken this company which are involved in corruption scandals. And if it's not involved right now in the environmental disaster, all these last decades they were involved up to the point they are the biggest industry in the world of beef. So in my point of view, the approval of this agreement will fortify their position, will fortify the industry, and will fortify Brazilian dependency on beef exports. So by the Brazilian point of view, politically and environmentally, it would be terrible to give more money and to put the company even closer to the government interests on international trade. So yes, they cannot be the worst player with the related with the Amazon fire, but for sure, yes, fortifying this company and fortifying the beef exportation sector, it will bring even more painful consequences on the environment, on politics, and even on economy. But for sure, it's not a good argument to give more money and give more power to the biggest company and one of the most pollutive companies in the world. So it doesn't seem to me an argument. It's only seems to me a repetition of Brazilian history in which this sector was always benefited in favor of the environment.
Okay, very clear. Thanks for that, Gabriel. I think, Anja, that the debate will continue over the coming 2 months. I think that all the presentations today gave us a very good idea about the devastating situation in the Mercosur countries and the potential impact on the situation in the EU. So let's see what will happen over the coming month in the Parliament and in the Council. And something we really need to reflect upon is how the intergroup could also potentially support civil society in the Mercosur countries. So we are closing the debate today, but it will continue for sure. Over to you, Anja, for your closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Reineke. Well, we are indeed approaching the end of this meeting today, and we heard a lot of interesting facts. We heard about the devastating effect the EU-Mercosur trade deal will have on environment, on the climate, and on animal welfare. And concluding the debate, I would like to refer back to some key issues and some demands we could ask for as the intergroup members. Firstly, to review the market access offer, to further and substantially limit the volume granted in tariff rate quotas for animal-based products, and especially for bovine and chicken products. To include animal welfare conditions for all trade preferences granted to animal products. To strengthen the TSD chapter and its enforcement mechanisms. This could be done by establishing a proper monitoring mechanism to assess the impact of the implementation of the trade deal on animals, on the environment, and on people, and by introducing material penalties in case of violation of these provisions. We have to make trade deals compatible with ambitious and with our ambitions and our commitments in all policy areas and agreements, such as the Paris Agreement and the Green Deal. Furthermore, to include a comprehensive cooperation mechanism on animal welfare. This should not only cover, of course, farm animal welfare, but also animal use in science and animals living in the wild, with a clear objective to improve the protection of animal welfare and their habitats by enacting and implementing stronger legislation. To review the chapter on technical barriers to trade, to avoid any obstacle to the future imposition of a method of production label on imported products too. And we need to introduce a provision in the chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary measures protecting the right of the EU to rely on the precautionary principle in the field of food safety. And I would say the EU precautionary principle should be leading principle at all times. And in case of absence of such modifications, we as MEPs fighting for the welfare of animals cannot turn a blind eye, and we should reject the Mercosur EU Free Trade Agreement. Before I close the meeting, I want to invite you all to the next intergroup meeting in October. That will be about the European Court of Justice opinion on slaughter without pre-stunning. And we will inform you about the details of the meeting in due course. Thank you for your attendance and contributions of today, and I hope to see you soon. Have a nice day. Bye.